to our talk show on Cordillera autonomy in relation to the cultural self. So we have a guest speaker for today, but before I introduce the guest speaker, let me just share about self-determination theory, a theory in positive psychology which talks about three components for flourishing. One is the component on competence, that is how we navigate our environment, and then the component on autonomy, how we have control over the course of our lives, and lastly on relatedness, on how we relate to others and have close relationships with others. But one of the focus for today's talk is on autonomy, as it is relevant because our speaker will be sharing about Cordillera collective experiences on how it influenced our identity and our experiences for developing not only the region as a whole or communities, but also individuals who belong to the Cordillera region. So right now, our speaker was once a youth activist for IP rights, human rights, and the anti-dictatorship movement in the 70s and 80s. He participated in the legislative process of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act by submitting various position papers submitted to the Senate in 1997. He worked in the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples and participated in the drafting of the IPRAS, IRR, and he represented the NCIP in various interagency treaty monitoring bodies such as the Convention on the Human Rights of Women and Children, ILO Convention 169, and others. He joined the private sector as writer, editor, and columnist in the Zigzag Weekly. He is now currently working at the MPLGU and a member of the SPCAR's Speakers Bureau of NEDA. So let us welcome Sir Gary Pekas. But before I pass the floor to him, let me give the question that he would be answering for our talk show. So how can autonomy enhance cultural identity and development of individuals and the community in the Cordillera, especially nowadays?
Before I respond to that question, we have to understand that our identity as communities, as individuals, was very limited just a few decades ago. For instance, many of our people in the communities never went out of the communities. So their sense of their worldview was literally limited by what they saw when they went out of their homes. They did not know, they probably knew of their neighbors, but only from stories and mostly on an almost antagonistic way, like these were close communities. In that sense, their identity was limited to themselves, their families, and the location they were in. So in these communities, you would identify yourself by your parents or by where your household is, or where your house is within the village. And that they did not even, most of these villages didn't even have a name for the village within. Only when you relate to other villages will you have a name for that village. They just, for the most part, they just called it by a generic name, which is Ili, which literally means village. Now, later on, when people started getting out because of when conflicts with other villages became less and less diminished because they became more open, most likely because of the interventions of the colonial powers like education and the acceptance of these colonial powers would mean that they would accept their neighbors also. This does not mean, however, that they did not know their neighbors, because they did, because even with intermittent conflicts with their neighbors, there were long periods of peace where they could trade and learn from each other. In this sense, while they identified themselves with their family and their ili, their village, they also knew of other villages and identified them as others. So, for instance, let me cite an example. The village of Mainit in Bontoc would have neighbors like Ginaang and Maligkong. They would call them Imaligkong, Iginaang, and the others would call them Imainit. However, they were essentially different. The culture was very similar, actually, but they had distinct territories and the cultural nuances. These minor differences were major ones to them, because that defined their identity, and that was the identity that defined them as an ili. Later on, when they got out, why did they go out? Before they went out for trade and so on and so forth, they brought back in influences from other villages, other communities, and adopted this. But they remained still different from others. Later on, when they went out to attend schools, this is where some major changes came in. Because the generation that went to school in the 60s and 70s, prior to that, there were those who actually went out, but these were very few. But in the 60s and 70s, they congregated here in La Trinidad, in Baguio, because this is where the colleges were. When they came here, they suddenly had to acquire a different sense of belongingness to a new community other than the villages that they came from. So what community would you navigate towards to belong to when there was none? So this is where they came to realize, understand, by force of necessity and by natural adjustment to the situation, that they came to consider their neighbors and probably enemies in previous inter-village conflicts as their new community. This is when organizations such as the BIBA, this conglomeration of students from the sub-provinces of Bontoc, Ifugao, Benguet, Apayao, and Kalinga, they had to come together because they were closest to their culture and their sense of self, and there was this overpowering burden that they had to bear, which was the discrimination against them as a whole. This is the reason why it was during that time, in the 60s and 70s, that the BIBA and other similar organizations became relevant, because it became the village of the students in the educational centers. This is a start of a bigger identity. In the villages, you have your belongingness to that community as the defining point of your identity. But outside of the village, you have to create your own community that you will belong to. This is where the BIBA comes in. And when it was started by some things, like, for instance, when Carlos P. Romulo, the previous Secretary General of the United Nations from the Philippines, wrote a book in praise of the United States as the colonizers of these islands. He wrote the book, I forget the title, you have to research that. Anyway, in one passage of that book, he said that Igorots are not Filipinos. Now, Igorots would collectively refer to all the people from the Cordilleras, those who were not Christianized, those who were not colonized during the Spanish colonial period. When Carlos P. Romulo wrote that these organizations, the BIBAC organizations, rose up to assert their being Filipinos, no? Which is another step in the development of identity from the Ili to the region meaning the BIBAC, the collective identity of the Cordilleras, and then the identity of being Filipinos, that they refused or they denied that statement that they are indeed Filipinos, even if they were not colonized by the Spaniards. In a sense, this is just another step in the development of cultural identity. And this is apparent now when the dances that the Igorots were dancing has become a regional dance. No? Purists would assert, some cultural purists would assert that these dances should not be danced, the gong should not be played when the ritual that requires it is not performed. However, since it has become a part of a larger culture, the marriage of cultures and being carried by a new generation which is no longer bound by those same rituals and the community that perform those rituals, but elevating it into a regional consciousness that the Ifugao dance is also the dance of the Ibaloys and the Kankanais, because everybody can do it, everybody can learn it. And so this sense of commonness or ownership of these cultural forms became a defining component of what Cordillerans are now. There are other examples that I would like to point out, specifically about two major problems that the Cordilleras had to deal with in the 70s and 80s. This is the Cellophil Resources Corporation, which logging concession, which was awarded. This Cellophil Resources Corporation was awarded 100,000 hectares for logging, stretching from the boundary of Mountain Province and Abra all the way to the boundary of Apayao and Ilocos Norte. A sister company, the Cellulose Processing Corporation, was given another 100,000 hectares to log. It threatened all the communities that in this area, no? From Busao in Mountain Province all the way to Apayao. The initial activities of the project or the corporation, the logging operation, was in Abra, and so it was the Abra people who suffered first. But when they were driven out of their homes under the pretext that they did not own the lands where their communities were, they were forced out of those areas. Where did they run to? They ran to their neighbors close by. And since these were along the borders of these artificially drawn borders because of the territorial boundaries set by the colonial government and the Philippine government later on, these are artificial borders actually, because they are neighbors, they knew each other, but it was just a line that was drawn. When they were threatened, they went to Mountain Province and Kalinga to these communities who were traditional enemies, intermittent enemies, but also their friends and neighbors. This common threat, somehow bound these communities together, that they are not different from each other. They have the same problems, and the solution to those problems are also similar. No? This also happened with the Chico River Dam project when the government planned to build 4 big dams stretching from Tabuk in Kalinga all the way to Gonogon in Mountain Province. When and if these projects would have been completed, all the communities from that stretch, almost 100 kilometers of river, all the communities near those riverbanks would have been relocated. So the threat was common. No? And so they had to go outside of their communities, because even though their communities were under threat and they were willing to fight for these communities, they also knew that others were in the same predicament. And so they congregated together. And so a series of meetings were being conducted among the communities affected by the Chico River Dam, and another series of meetings were being conducted by the communities affected by the logging operation of Selfie. And then later on, when both these groups were gaining strength in protest to these projects, they came together because the overriding or the basic reason why their communities were being threatened was based on the same assumption that they do not own the land. In a way, this like the discrimination that the students experience in Baguio and in Manila, it drew them together. So it reminds us that even though self-determination is inherent in every community can and should and have decided from themselves about how to live, when to go to war, when to schedule the agricultural season, everything. No? When they had conflicts within, they decided for themselves. This is inherent. However, only when it was threatened did they feel that they have that right. They took it for granted in the first place, but when it was threatened, they knew that they had the right and they had to assert it. They had to continue doing it, deciding for themselves. And when they knew that other communities were experiencing the same, they understood each other, and somehow they transcended the simple village level community that they were practicing, the village level autonomy, that they were practicing for a long time, that they knew that they had to decide on themselves, but at a different level, they had to decide with their neighbors. They had to be autonomous within the village and autonomous with the other villages experiencing the same. This is the reason why autonomy for the Cordilleras is currently being discussed and has been discussed for a long time, because of this reality that we practiced autonomy for a long time. It was threatened, and we want to continue being autonomous at the village level, but we like to go above the village and become autonomous as a region, because we see a lot of that would help us as communities, as members of the community, and for everybody.
Thank you, Sir Gary, for sharing that a bit of history and how the regional identity was formed, and it's relevant for us residing here in the Cordillera. But one question that remains is that in this time, because we have this Cordillera autonomous administrative region right now, and most of us would say that it seems that CAR as of today is good. So why do we need to push for an autonomous region of Cordillera in this time, and for the young people of the I generation of today to realize how important this issue is?
Before I respond to that, I would like to situate it in the current times. We are still in a state of flux, of continuous change. The development of a global identity and everything now, and the amount of information available to us has opened up a lot of avenues for development. And for many of our younger people, of our youth, they no longer feel the sense of belongingness even to their community. No? When they go home, they would rather not participate in the traditional rituals and activities. No? Even the belief system, believing in the anitos and in the spirits of the mountains and everything, and believing in the power of their ancestors who are no longer in this world to help them. That, in a sense, has undermined the sense of belongingness. Yes, they belong to a community because of their ancestry, because of their progeny, but they do no longer participate in community activities. This is the reality. So even the threat that is already historical. It happened just less than 50 years ago when these communities were, the survival of these communities was under grave threat. No? But it's history, and somehow it was resolved. And so the youth would rather not talk about it. No, it's history, no? But let us be reminded that the same threat still stands. No? It's still a Damocles sword hanging over our heads, because it's based on the premise that the land does not belong to our communities. I would like to remind us that when the Spaniards came, they superimposed the Regalian Doctrine, which is a legal theory that says that all lands in colonized lands, all the resources, all the lands, even the people, belong to the king of the colonizing power. In our case, the king of Spain. And so, because of this belief, you can only make use of the land if the king allows you so. But then this is only possible when the king gives you title. No? So this is what happened in the Philippines actually. So that some families were favored, and we have the encomiendas and haciendas in the lowlands. So all the other people who were not given title became the subjects of these powerful individuals and families who had them as tenants and were responsible for the collection of taxes. In our case, in the Cordilleras, we would like to say that we were not colonized by the Spaniards, because the Spaniards did not have the same setup. But in the mind of the colonizers, we do not own the land because we were not given title. When the Americans came in, when they bought the Philippines from Spain for $20 million, the sale included all the lands and resources and the subjects, the people themselves, for $20 million. And so when the Public Land Act of 1902 was enacted by the Americans here in the Philippines, it went under the same premise that in order for anybody to make use of the land or to get from its resources, they will have to be given title. In the Cordilleras, we were never given title to these same lands. And in 1975, the late dictator Ferdinand Edralin Marcos signed Presidential Decree 705, where it was stated that all lands with slopes more than 15 degrees, this is about this, 15 degrees, or 18%, all lands with slopes more than this are automatically public land and part or forest reserve. And in the Cordilleras, 90% of our lands are in this category. The same law still applies, meaning that anytime the government can assert this law and would make us and drive us out. Now, when they want to develop things, no? It is ironic, no? That indeed we won a battle, several battles against the Philippine Resources Corporation, against the Chico River Dam project, against Marcos Park in Taloy in Tuba. But the problem still remains. No? This is the reason why, for you kids or children, if you still go home to your villages, your parents do not have titles to their lands, and they only have tax declarations, if they have tax declarations as proof of ownership. But even in the tax declaration, it's written there that it is for tax purposes only, and not a recognition of ownership. This is also the reason why the licensing agencies for several activities in the country, for instance, the Water Resources Board, National Water Resources Board, which gives water rights to anybody, does not recognize that you own the water flowing into your homes from your from the faucet. No? They do not recognize that the water irrigating your fields are rightfully yours, because you were never given these rights at all. But they can freely give this to hydro corporations. And they did. Only when a hydro project affects our community are we involved. And how are we involved? Only to make sure that the provisions of law apply as to our benefits. Only to make sure that we actually profit from what the law says. But under autonomy, if we are given the right to manage our resources, we can actually claim more benefits because we own the right to the water. We own the right to the land where they will put up these structures to generate power, and so on and so forth. And even though it would be preposterous that they will still plan similar projects like the Cellfield logging operations and the Chico River Dam projects, it would be preposterous. They still can, because we do not own the land as they see it. Autonomy will give us the opportunity to develop our own laws so that our rights to the lands where our houses stand, to our fields, to the forests would be recognized.
So thank you very much for that, because you have traced that part in history and that important concept about not owning the land. Right now, many of the I generation, I presume, would have forgotten this important part of history, and this might be a collective amnesia for us and for the younger generation. And when we forget this, it will affect how we decide for the future. So thank you for sharing that. I think so, and with the issues of Beneco and the issues that, especially here in Benguet, Cordillera is rich in many natural resources, but we do not really maximize these resources, and it's the outsiders, big companies who maximize these resources, and development becomes stagnated for us.
There is this argument that even the generations before us would argue, no, that the mines here in Benguet province were actually good because it provided employment to so many and gave so many of us a foothold in this new economy, so that our people can go to school, the children can go to school. Yes, but those miners worked for that, for the mizzling wages that they received. No, the major benefits, the major profits of these companies were going to the stockholders, and if. And not to the workers. No? Even their benefits were somehow minimized, no? And they were working under subhuman conditions. Even in violation of safety regulations in those bygone times. It's true that the laws were not so advanced now when compared to now, when safety regulations are much better developed. No? But the point is, yes, it benefited us, but only very limitedly, and we worked for it. Those were wages, not the benefits of the resources themselves. No? We could have worked for wages by working the fields. No? We were mere employees in a very big operation. When even the Mining Act of 1995 only grants the Philippine government as a share, and this is what goes to the government. No? There are some items, but this is very important, that only 1% of the milling costs, meaning the processing costs from ore into gold ingots and gold bars, if it's gold, only 1% of the processing cost is the entitlement of government. No? Everything goes to the stockholders. Okay, let us say that Filipinos are stockholders. Okay, good. But how about the communities hosting these very industries? No? And they have, many of these communities even were exploiting the same resource before these companies came in. The argument for the management of resources is that we are the community that will be affected either way, when it's exploited, when it's not. And we should decide what happens. In the case of Benguet, many of the mines are already mined out, meaning that it's no longer profitable to go deep underground, because many of our mines here have tunnels going below sea level, that workers would travel to their work site and work only for 30 minutes, from 1 hour or even 30 minutes to 2 hours, and then travel back up to the surface. No? But it was still profitable, meaning that the resources are really extensive and concentrated. That's why it's possible to do that. Okay. What happened to the communities when the mines were depleted of these resources? They became abandoned towns. No? And while, let's take Mangkayan, for example, where Lipanto has operated for a long time. While some scientists would say that since Mangkayan is sinking, Mangkayan hosts the Lipanton. Sometimes scientists would say that the mines are not related, but some people would argue common sense, that after you dig out what is underneath the town, it's but natural that it will sink. No? Nonetheless, that is not that may be relevant in a way, but what is more relevant is what will Lipanto leave behind. The communities around it are still agricultural based. And how many billions of dollars worth of gold and copper were taken out of Mangkayan municipality. The same with Itogon, with the Benguet Corporation operated. The people in the main are still agricultural, living their lives as before. Of course, some of them worked in the mines. Some from Mountain Province and Kalinga and Pangasinan also went there to work and probably benefited from the wages that they received. But the large amount of money were taken by the stockholders. And since these companies were set up by the Americans, mostly by Americans. And what is left with the people, the communities, abandoned bank houses. Did they develop? Yes, they did. But did they develop enough? No. And the reason is they did not control the same resource. Because you could have gained a lot more.
Yeah. That is a sad part of development in history. Host communities do not develop. I've heard of stories from my students who would share that their parents would go abroad in search of a greener future instead of pursuing their development here in the province of Benguet or in the Cordillera as a whole. And at the cost of migration, their families' bonding and closeness would be sacrificed. So, as a region, as a province, many is being sacrificed for the cost of development, but we could have chosen a better future. So this is for autonomy. So thank you very much, Sir Gary, for sharing that. If you have more questions, you could post it in this FB post, and we will be answering maybe in another video your questions. Okay, so we would like to thank you also, the UPAW of BSU and NEDA SPCAR for hosting this talk show. Thank you very much.